Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. What's the scariest story you know, real or fake? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Holy shit, that gave me goosebumps as well, and also made me want to cry a little bit. I once had a friend tell me about a girl she knew who met up with a guy she met on some online dating site. They met for dinner, and afterwards he walked her to her car. He kept trying and trying to get her to go home with him. She declined all invites, and eventually they kissed goodnight and went their separate ways. A few days later, she gets some weird bumps on her lips and goes to the doctor. After examining her, the doctor seems legitimately worried and asks her about her most recent romantic encounter because what she has is some sort of bacteria or something on her lips that you can only get from a decomposing body. Long, creepy-ass story short, an internet guy gets busted with like 4 dead female bodies in his apartment that he had been going down on, and having sex with. It could be total BS, but that story creeped me the F out for weeks. TLDR. A girl gets a weird rash from kissing a guy she met online on the first date. It turns out he killed a bunch of girls and was having sex with their bodies. I'm a camp counselor, and I told a variation of the Slender Man story where he is a traditional fae. They followed colonists to the New World and went insane and started killing people by stalking the naughty children who stayed out late. Oh, and by the way, my gimmick as a storyteller is that all my stories are true, and I worked up to this story over 4 weeks, starting with the tame shit, and I ended with that. All my campers were crying, as were some of my coworkers. I scared myself so much that I refused to leave my cabin after full darkness for the remaining 3 days I was there. It's late. There are 3 people on a subway train sitting in a row. There are 2 men and a woman in the middle. A teenage girl walks on the subway and sits across from the 3 strangers. The woman in the middle has an expressionless look on her face, while the 2 men are staring directly into the teenager's eyes. Shortly after, a businessman enters the subway who sits next to the teenager. After a few minutes, he pulls out his notepad and writes, "Get off the next stop, trust me." When the next stop comes, the teenager and the businessman get up and exit the cab when the 2 men verbally try to stop them. When they get off, the man explains to the teenager that the woman in the middle of the 2 men was dead, and they were after her next. I heard this when I was in 7th grade. Always freaked me out. There was a young man named Tom who didn't exactly have the best home life. Every night Tom went to sleep, buried under the covers, trying to silence all the noise. Every night there were arguments, even with all his blankets on. Tom could still hear them as clearly as day. They always got louder and louder, so even if Tom was lucky enough to fall asleep before it started, it was guaranteed he would be woken up. The only thing he could do was lie there and pretend to be asleep. Sometimes he heard slapping or hitting. It's best to stay quiet. There's no need to get involved. Some nights, she would come into Tom's room and sit in the chair by his bed. She would sit there for hours and just sob. Tom didn't know if the yelling or sobbing was worse. He just wanted to escape. But Tom couldn't escape. It was the only place he could afford. Although he lived alone, he knew he was never alone. Father, I had a bad dream. You take a sip of vodka and roll over. You stare at the clock tower on Sobornia Square. It's 3:23. Go back to sleep. There's work tomorrow. No, Father. The familiar warm buzz of vodka starts to sink in. You can barely make out your daughter's pale form in the darkness. Why is that, Devochka moya? Because in my dream, when I was about to go back to sleep, the thing wearing mother's skin sat up. You pause, face your daughter, and look at her intensely. The figure behind you begins to stir. Don't talk that way about your brother. It's not his fault. We have no money for coats, such as life in Moscow. This happened to me, and it still freaks me out when I'm home alone. When I was 16 a few summers ago, my parents went out for the day, and my sister left to go out too. I live in an averagely small suburban neighborhood. I was stuck in the house, bored with my dog, with nobody else home. It was really hot in the living room, so I turned on the air conditioner. For that to happen, I need to open the garage door because the butt of the air conditioner faces in there and the garage gets overheated. Usually, when we do this, we lock the garage door that leads into the living room, but this time I forgot. I sat down in my room and relaxed, not thinking much of it. Bad idea. A few hours later in the afternoon, I hear my dog barking like a maniac. I almost ignored it, but I went into the living room and heard the doorknob on the garage door jiggling. I assumed that my sister was coming home, so I yelled, "It's not locked." She didn't respond back, and the doorknob jiggled more violently. I walked in and went to the door, yelling again, "It's not when the door opened. It felt like slow motion. The door creaked open a sliver of a crack, and that's all I needed to see. Just past the feet, huge, dark brown hiking boots of a man, not my sister. I immediately pushed on the door to close it again and started screaming and crying hysterically. I'm a small girl, but I struggled to push it shut and lock it. He started pounding on the door, but then it stopped. Hysterically crying and screaming, I scooped up my dog and ran into the kitchen to get a knife. When I went into the kitchen, I heard the gate in the backyard open and quick footsteps down the cement path, like in the horror movies. With tears streaming down my face, I screamed, "No!" With a dog in one hand and a knife in the other, I threw the knife on the floor and ran to lock the back door. When I quickly bent down on the kitchen floor to pick up the knife, my legs were shaking from being so scared. My weak legs gave out, and I fell forward almost onto my face. I tried to scramble to my feet, but ended up crawling and tripping on the kitchen floor. And I accidentally scratched a long, shallow cut on my bare foot with a knife. I hid under the dining room table and said my prayers. I thought this was it. This is how I'm going to die. I'm here in the quiet, empty house with my dog as a witness. I held my mouth to cover my crying when I heard footsteps approach the back door. My heart was racing a million beats per minute, and I had the knife tightly clenched in my hand as I waited for him to make his next move. I saw his shadow through the blinds, looking into the window. He stood there for a while and then walked out. The police never found him. To this day, I always make sure the door is locked when the garage door is open. I don't know what would have happened if my dog wouldn't bark and alert me that there was a man trying to break in. I would have been in my room completely unaware until it was too late. A young girl named Lisa was left alone on several accounts as her parents worked late. Her parents bought her a dog to keep her company. One night, Lisa was awoken by constant dripping sound. She got up and went to the kitchen to turn the tap off properly. As she was getting back into bed, she stuck her hand under the bed and the dog licked it. The dripping sound continued, so she went to the bathroom and turned the tap off properly in there too. She went back to the bedroom and stuck her hand under the bed and the dog licked it again. But the dripping continued, so she went outside and turned off the taps out there too. She came back to bed, stuck her hand under it, and the dog licked it again. The dripping continued, drip, drip, drip. This time she listened and located the source of the dripping. It was coming from her cupboard. She opened the cupboard door, and there was her dog hanging upside down with its skin peeled off, and written on the window in blood was, "Humans can lick hands too." It's good to see that people are still telling this story years later. I think I first heard it in 8th grade, and I'm old. So, nice. Classic. The story of a babysitter who puts the kids to bed and goes into the parents' room to watch TV. She calls the parents to update them, says she's going to watch TV in their room, and asks if they mind if she covers up the clown statue in their room because it's scaring her. The parents tell her to get their kids and go to the neighbor's house because they don't have a clown statue in their room. Snopes says the story could be true as well, or at least part of it. I forgot which, but apparently there was a call to a police station telling a story along these lines, and when police officers responded, they found a man fleeing the scene dressed like a clown. I knew a girl who said that while home alone she heard a tapping sound on the floor of her kitchen coming from the basement. She's worried it might be a pipe leaking, so she uses her house phone to call her dad, and he tells her not to worry about it. After hanging up the house phone, her cell phone immediately rings. It's her dad, telling her to call the cops and get them out because he heard someone breathing on the other end of the line. She gets out of the house and calls the cops. The cops show up, search the house, and find some psychos in the basement with a machete. Apparently, he had been tapping it against the basement ceiling in an attempt to lure her downstairs. If she'd gone down into the basement, she probably would have never come back up. My buddy just told me this one the other day. So his sister had 3 friends who went down to Mexico for a fun week of drinking and vacation fun. They were at a bar a night or so before they were supposed to leave, having a good time, and it turns out their friend just up and disappeared. Her phone was unresponsive, and she had completely vanished from the bar. Well, they were all shit-faced, so the 2 friends just assumed she had gone back to the hotel or had ended up with some hot guy or something somewhere. It turns out she wasn't at the hotel. After a lot of commotion, they were driving back toward the US when they were elated to see their friend sitting in a car with a few Mexican gentlemen on a lane or so behind them. Strangely, all efforts to contact are in vain. Waving, screaming, and making any kind of commotion ends up with an absolutely zero response from her. They alerted the border patrol that their friend, who had been missing, was spotted in a car along the highway. The border patrol stops the car and investigates. As it turns out, there was a pretty good reason why the friend wasn't acknowledging their presence. The friend was dead, but not only were they communicating with the friend's dead corpse, her organs had been completely removed from her body, and she had been stuffed into the brim with drugs. Dead, organs gone, stuffed with drugs. I was pretty effed up after hearing the part to pry about the happened afterwards, but the image of her friends trying to communicate with their dead bodies, their same friend they just partied with the night before. A member of my squad, a fairly odd individual who will be named X, started complaining one week that he kept seeing something through his NVGs while on night patrol in the city. He wasn't sure what it was, but it wasn't a human or anything, so it raised no suspicion, and we just thought, oh, that's just X being X, and laughed it off. A few days go by, and after another night patrol, he can't sleep and is sweating and freaking out. While all are asking him, dude, what's going on? You alright? His response was, death is following me. He claimed to be able to see a shadow figure floating from rooftop to rooftop and following our patrol, if it was only visible through NVGs and not by streetlights or anything. If you ever been to Iraq and used NVGs and just watched the sky, sometimes there would always be weird flashes and shit with no explanation. But we figured and just thought that X being X and laughed it off. The very next day, X was killed in action. I freaked the fuck out on my whole platoon, and we really don't know what to make of it. This is not a story, it actually happened to me. I was visiting my grandmother in Mexico City. She had a great big 2-story house, and we were upstairs on the floor with the bedrooms. It was really late at night, my grandmother was already asleep. I was up watching TV when I heard an animal roar really loudly outside through my open window. This was no normal roar, it was really loud. The closest thing I could match to it was a lion or a tiger. It was really weird, because this is in the middle of a gigantic city, nowhere near the wilderness. The zoo is also halfway across town, so there was no chance of the noise coming from there. It kept on for a long time, just roaring and growling and pacing in the street below my open window for more than an hour. I was really freaked out. Finally, I got some balls and went to my grandfather's study, got his gun loaded, and went back to bed. I was just dreaming that whatever was making that awful roaring sound would look up and notice the light coming from my open window. The noise continued for a while until it finally began to move away. I finally mustered up enough courage to look out the window, but saw nothing, and could still hear the roaring off in the distance. The next day, I scoured the newspaper and news for a story for a wild animal escaping, but found nothing. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't really sure what to make of it. To resume, I was visiting Grandma in the middle of a huge city when I heard a large beast prance and roar outside the house. I cowered like a pussycat holding a loaded gun, too scared to look outside until I moved away. I still have no clue what it was. The real story is here. My dad works as a janitor for an orphanage in the city, fixing stuff and so on. The property of the orphanage belonged to an old lady who died a few days ago. When my dad first started the job, the old lady showed him around all the rooms, and when they got the basement, my dad noticed a welded iron door. "What's in there?" he asked. "That's a private room. Nobody's allowed to go in there. It has been shut down for 50 years now, and it'll stay that way." So, now the old lady is dead, and the property belongs to the manager of the orphanage. She refuses to crack the door open, even though she doesn't know what's down there. There's no key for the door. You'd have to blow it up to get in the room, and it's surrounded by 30 centimeters of concrete. It gets worse. We're in Germany, and about 3 years ago, there was an M1911 found about 3 meters in the ground above the basement. The M1911 is an American weapon. What do you think is in there? We don't know. Me and my dad will try to go in there someday.